So implementation approach. So this is how are we doing it. So if you got a bit of a sense now on what we're trying to do, we're trying to set up a risk-based approach, and we're doing it by play. And what we're doing is saying to companies, once we declare a play, you must come up with a plan. Either a project plan, or if we can convince them to get together, you come up with a play plan, and you must address these particular areas to our satisfaction. We're not going to tell you how, we're just saying you must address them in whatever you think makes the most sense. So where we are now is trying to figure out how does that actually going to work? How do we accept the plan? Who looks at it? What needs to be in the plan? How do we know whether we should approve or deny it? All of those, getting into the detail now. So the way we've done it, we've got 12 sub-teams internally, and on the next slide I'll show what they look like. But the thing to point out, and this is one that comes back to us as well, is this is a project out of RDB, which is my branch, and it's not. This has been to this point, and piece that we really want to make clear, this project is an enterprise-wide one, and when you look at the people working on these plans, I think we've got Carol sitting in the back is probably the only one from my branch that's full-time on it, and now we have some full-time players on the project that are from other branches. So it's really a cross-branch project. And I think I've got most of the branches that are involved in there, except I forgot legal on there. But they're heavily involved as well. And we've been working heavily with what was Alberta Environment Water, which is now Environment Water and SRD all rolled into one. And we have to renew that discussion with them. So how does it work? There's these 12 teams. A very busy slide, but just to give you a sense of what they're doing. The bubbles that are in dark orange are teams that are up and running. So Mark had asked about the compliance piece, and it's one of the bubbles that's shaded in towards the end because we don't have a team lead on that one. We haven't got that team up and running yet, but it's one that we have to do. So if they're in orange, we've got a team lead, and we've got the teams either at various degrees. Some are well on their way, and some are kind of ramping up. So the teams the way the diagram works is coming in from the left is the framework design. It's done. So what the diagram is showing is the implementation piece. And when we get to the end of the diagram, we're really happy because we're complete and we can take a day off. So that's what we're striving for. So where we are is, first step is we've identified the risks. We're moving into risk mitigation. What do we need to do to mitigate those risks? Variety of teams. The water management team is one that we've got Alberta Environment folks working right on the team, and they're meeting I think today in Red Deer on a bunch of this stuff. So they're working away. We've got a technical operations team that's Hal Knox is leading, that's looking at technical issues in the well. And some of the life cycle wellbore integrity stuff comes out of that, and we're working with Ron on. Reservoir management, surface issues, we don't have anybody working on at the moment. Life cycle wellbore integrity, which is kind of related to this, and we don't really have a separate one for that, but they're rolled in together. But once we kind of figure out how we want to mitigate the risk, then we have to pull it all together into some sort of a process. So we form all it into something like an application that would come in, or a project plan that would come into the board. And what these folks are looking at is how does that work? So the first ones they're looking at are how do you do a PAT approval? And then they're going to look at how do you declare a play? What's all the pieces around that? And then what do we do with a project or a play plan? What goes into it? Who looks at it, all the process related to that. And then when they're done, we look at the regulatory response. So what requirements need to change, and how are we going to structure those requirements? So we're talking about a management-based approach rather than prescriptive regulation. And we're really good at writing new regulations and new directives, and away we go. So we're suggesting performance-based or management-based, which is another topic. But what does that actually look like, and what does it mean, and how would you structure those requirements? So that's what these folks are going to do, and they're working. And then before we unleash this on the world and it goes amok on us, we want to test it. So the testing is being done in a team called the Duvernay team that we have a team lead, and we're getting the rest of the team built almost as we speak. And we have another team that's looking at performance measures and indicators. And that's a critical one, because what we're saying, if we're going to allow management-based process, we're going to tell companies what the objectives are. Now we have to figure out whether they're meeting them, and what are good performance measures. How do we know? And that's what these folks are doing. And then the compliance piece that we don't have yet, and then ultimately the final delivery of what URF looks like. What we don't want to do is have a 4,000-page directive called directive whatever going out as a new directive we're looking at a quite different approach to how we get that out. So we're really looking at combining more of a life cycle process with an education process and a bunch of other stuff all into one. Now, we've got some thoughts of what that might be, a lot more web-based than what we've been used to, but there's a fair bit of work that needs to go into that. And then when that's all done, it pops out at the end. The other pieces that are critical to it, and as I learn more as I go along, probably one of the most critical is the top bubble, which goes right across, and that's communication and stakeholder engagement, which means externally and internally. And we've got folks, Elizabeth from the Stakeholder Engagement Office has been involved in this. We got our communications folks involved in this. Charlene's been huge on the change management aspect, and she told us that right at the beginning. That is going to be one of the biggest issues you have to deal with, and yeah, sure. And we're learning as we go down. It is, without question, one of the toughest things. It's to do these kinds of things and convince people, first off, something's changed here, and we need to get ahead of that. And then we have to let them know, what does this mean? How's it going to impact on your jobs? And a lot of people want to know that. It could be very minimal to a lot, depending on how far we're willing to go with some of this. So as an example, with the Duvernay team, we're testing a multidisciplinary approach. So the idea is we're setting it up for a play, and we're going to test these processes. So a project plan comes in. Those folks will be responsible to look at that plan and determine, does it meet the requirements that we've set out? But they'll be doing it differently than we typically would, where you'd go to applications branch who might throw a piece into the geology folks to look at, or economics folks, where it's kind of fragmented. The idea here is the same team looks at the whole thing from start to finish, and then meets with the companies. If there's 4 or 5 different operators, they'll meet with all 4 or 5 operators and understand what's going on in the field, understand what's working. They'll be the ones that'll be looking at the performance measures to see, are they meeting the requirements? Or they may look at and say, we don't have enough data, we got to get better data. So it's a new way of operating. If it works, which we don't know, and that's why we want to test it, it could lead to a different way we do our business totally. And it doesn't necessarily just apply to unconventional. The good pieces we can expand and take further if it works. So science and information, that's we need to know where the shales are. We need to know where the groundwater is. There's a whole bunch of information we need to learn, and we're working with the AGS folks that are giving us some really good information on that. Some is going to be published here fairly shortly. So part of the exercise will be, what tools do they need to efficiently go through lots of information quickly and make good decisions? So this is where we're working with the EDT folks and Ercb Connect to figure out how can we look at lots of information very quickly to make good decisions. Because if we can't do that, this isn't going to work. I mean, we need technology to help us through this process. So, okay, so that's really what the concept looks like. This is going to talk about some of the things that we're working on right now that we hope to deliver on in the next little while. So we split them into short-term deliverables, which is from now into the fall, medium term, which puts us into January, February timeframe, and then we're to be complete the project by the end of 2013. So that's the longer term. So short term, we're looking at the fracture fluid chemical disclosure requirements. That's in flight right now, and we're working closely with BC Oil and Gas. They have bought the rights to a website called fracfocus.ca, which was developed in the United States, and we're using that as our choice because it's already half the work's done. But there's a lot of effort in getting compliance on submission requirements and in getting stuff up and running. So the EDT folks have been working very, very hard. There's about, I think, a team of about almost a dozen people now working full bore at trying to get this done and ready by the fall. What we're looking at doing, it's not on this slide because I actually showed this slide to Cap and I didn't want to get them all in a knot yet, but we're looking at likely putting out a hydraulic fracturing directive over the next, and we're trying to do this differently too and do it in a very short time frame, but it would include pretty much everything that's on here. So fracture fluid chemical disclosure requirements. Another one is around notification to the field office when somebody wants to conduct a frac. Let them know that it's going on, and that is already in the works. Should be pretty straightforward. The interwell communication issue, where they've had situations where somebody's fracked into a producing well and blowing stuff out of the top. We're going to put some requirements around that. And then old well bores near, so that we can reduce that risk. And we're coming at these again more from a performance base. So what we're going to be telling companies, likely, we haven't got the thing drafted, but we're not going to come up with a set of requirements necessarily. We're going to say, you need to understand what wellbores exist near where you're undertaking your operations and whether they could impact on those operations. So assess the risk, and then once you've done that, then you need to come up with a strategy to mitigate that risk, and you must be prepared to supply that to us. And we may audit you, or if something goes wrong, we'll be pulling those, and if they're not up to snuff, then you're in non-compliance. So we're working towards that. There is an issue. We've had some wells that are relatively shallow. They're kind of in that intermediate space. We've got requirements for shallow stuff that's 200 meters above, mostly around CBM. But we have had horizontal wells with multi-stage hydraulic fracking between 200 and 600 meters, and that's getting shallow enough that's starting to cause us some concern. So we're looking at that issue too. We need to mitigate the risk of those kinds of operations. So we're targeting the fall for a directive that would cover off all those. And it may be, we're actually trying to target the summer, but we'll see. And then the process deliverables, we're working, as I mentioned, on pad approvals and how do we declare a play. That work's going on right now. And on the data side, we've got requirements around what you must do from a logging perspective, data requirements on horizontal wells, which worked really well when we were just drilling a few. But now that that's becoming the majority, it's a redundant piece and it's driving industry crazy. They apply for waivers, and now staff are spending huge amounts of time just managing logging waivers. So it's clear that requirement has to change. These are some issues we put in front of CAP with the idea there's some technical issues that it would probably warrant us spending some time on a technical committee to try to resolve. We may put them in a hydraulic fracking directive as interim steps, recognizing a lot more work needs to be done on some of these to really to reduce the level of uncertainty. So the impact, if you take something like the impact on offset wells, there's a lot of work to understand what that might be under different scenarios. But we don't want to wait until all that work's done. So we're going to make sure there's something in place to deal with it now, but spend some time after the fact. Trespass issue is one. We're virtually saying from our mandate, we see that as low risk because there's no public impact, there's no conservation impact or environmental impact. The impact is equity. So I frack my well and I'm producing my neighbor's wells. So yahoo, they're not so happy, but I am. BC's had an incident where somebody fractured up into a formation that belonged to another operator, and they struggled. Now what do we do? So fortunately, it was a big operator that did it, and it was a little operator who owned the stuff above, so they just bought him out. So that solved the problem. But it raised a question for the BC Oil and Gas Commission. What do we do with these things? So they end up saying, if that happens, you're on your own. In other words, you go to the courts. You're going to have to duke that one out in the courts. So we left this question with industry and said, there's 2 or 3 different ways we can deal with that. Either you guys sort it out yourselves, or you sort it out in the courts, or you look at us for some sort of a role in that. But our view is we probably don't have much of a role, but we were kind of turned that one back to industry because it's really their issue. And then the flowback fluid management, we're hearing a lot about that. How come we don't make, as a requirement, all operators recycle every drop of water that flows back? And we encourage it in our directives, but we don't have anything that says you must. So we need to look at that. What is actually feasible, because sometimes it's just not feasible to recycle, reuse it all. But we need to have a look at that, and there's some work that needs to be done on that piece. And so the last slide, up to this point, sort of lessons and challenges. One of the things we're doing right now, and we're doing it internally and externally, is trying to get more awareness about the project. And that's not just internally, but our government of Alberta folks that are impacted by what we're doing want to know more. So we need to get out and do more of this. It's challenging for us because we're trying to get the work done, but at the same time, we need to get out and explain to people what it is we're trying to do. And it's the same people doing both, which makes it pretty darn challenging. So, but it has to be done, and that's the change management piece that Charlene's been really good about, helping us through what we need to do and telling us you need to do more of it. And inevitably, what we're finding, if you don't do enough of it, then your time spent trying to explain to people why you're doing what you're doing just goes up exponentially. And if we'd have done a good job at the beginning, you'd spend less time doing that. So change management is a big piece. Why are we doing this? What is the changes, and how are we impacted? And both from a staffing perspective, but also our external stakeholders. What does that mean? And then going things that we have to deal with to make sure people understand this is right across the organization. It's just not 1 or 2 branches, and which means competition for resources. There's lots going on, and for folks in the GEs and application areas in particular, we're always poaching their staff to put them on the project. And I think it's starting to get old for Stephen Smith and Kevin Parks. We're always not, every time they see me show up now, they close their blinds really quickly. They're not home. And then IT constraints. As we said, a lot of this is going to demand a big change in how we do our IT business. We're moving away from looking at data up front and being able to have dashboards of information that allow us to be able to understand what's going on very quickly in a play. We want to be a lot more visual, so spatially enabled, more GIS stuff. There's a lot of things there that we're going to be working on. It means some big changes there, so that can hold up how soon we deliver on some of this. And then stakeholder support. So what does industry think? What are they willing to support? And then the landowners and others. What are they, and GOA, how far are they willing to go? So far, the response has been very positive, and industry has been very positive. We've taken it to some counties. Dwayne's been out presenting some of this stuff. But they're also cautious. They want to see what the detail is going to look like. For industry, it's certainty and streamline and cost. And for landowners, it's water so far has been probably the primary issue. Water and trucks.